Thank you, Nikki. So we will continue with the session, introducing our next speaker. She is a futurist who focuses on the intersection of technology, policy, ethics, and leadership. Dr. Cara LaPointe is the co-director of Johns Hopkins Institute for Assured Autonomy, which works to ensure the autonomous systems are safe, secure, and trustworthy as they are increasingly integrated into every aspect of our lives. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Cara LaPointe.
Thanks so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the stuff we're doing. And I'm not going to talk so much about specific technologies today as the idea of assurance and trustworthiness, right? You know, this is something that applies in many domains. And as you're thinking about, obviously, in the space domain, this is critical. So if you want to advance the slides. Just to set up kind of the background, you know, autonomy is everywhere increasingly in our lives. And these are a lot of kind of mobility examples. We're seeing AI built into systems, whether it's cyber physical systems, vehicles, other physical systems, or decision algorithms. And really, autonomy is just AI-enabled systems that then act without human intervention. So if you want to go on. So we're really on this journey. You know, when I started in kind of quote the AI world 20 some years ago, you know, we were working with kind of what we call handcrafted knowledge, right? Human built models that were explainable, but maybe limited in some realms. And then we moved into kind of the whole machine learning era, right? And now when people say AI, they're often talking about machine learning, right? And we're moving on to contextual reasoning and continuing to develop the technology. But it's really, I would say there's this journey from advanced automation to true autonomy. And we're still on that journey. We have not kind of achieved the end of that. But as we look at more and more machine learning, it introduces many other ways that things could possibly go wrong. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what could possibly go wrong. So if you go to the next slide, please. You know, the stakes are really high. And if you go to the next slide, because what happens when? You know, there have been some very public examples in terms of things that have gone wrong, right? Also, in terms of, you know, just close calls that we've had. So we really have to think about how you start to prevent some of these issues from happening. So if you go to the next slide. So we look at this from a very holistic approach. This is not just a technology problem. This is not something where we're going to be able to take a number of engineers and, you know, put them on a problem for months at a time and have them solve it, because it's much more complex than that. So if you go on, you know, technology, having autonomous systems operating in the unconstrained world, right? Whether you're talking about the physical world, whether you're talking about the cyber world, there's still a lot of unsolved challenges with that. Right. So that's an important element of this. If you go to the next slide, we also think a lot about the ecosystem. What is the ecosystem that these technologies are being introduced into, right? Because that ecosystem itself will introduce many vulnerabilities into the technology that we have to think about from the very beginning. And beyond that, if you go to the next slide, we have to think about policy and other governance structures. So we think a lot about the strategic links between these pillars of how do policy and governance decisions affect the technology, right? How does the state of the art in technology affect what we're thinking about policy and governance? And how is it all going to play into the ecosystem? So if you go to the next slide, you heard me use a lot of different words along the way. I use some of these words and then there's even more. So there's really a whole range of issues when you think about in terms of when we talk about assurance, it's everything from highly technical issues to then, you know, those policy, legal, ethical issues, right? And if you go to the next slide, when we talk about assurance, there's no common definition of assurance, just like there's no common definition of autonomy. But when we're talking about assurance, it's really that broad range of challenges. So if you want to go to the next slide, what are the research questions that we look at, right, at Johns Hopkins as we think about things? So if you go to the next slide. This one I talked about, right? How do you ensure autonomous systems will operate safely in an unconstrained world? As long as we've had people working on autonomous systems and working on some of these issues, these are not fully, there are many research questions still related, right? How do we do test and evaluation? How do we know where the boundaries of the safe operating envelopes are of AI-enabled systems? Because these systems can fail catastrophically without graceful degradation and without warning, right? So how do we do this? How do we solve this problem? Next slide, please. How do you create better design tools to build more reliable autonomous systems from the very beginning? This is an example of a project we work on where we use a regression analysis tool to understand when you're basically improving your software, right? How do you make sure that you're not introducing new vulnerabilities while you're fixing old ones? Go on. Do all autonomous systems need to be explainable? Right? For all of you who use kind of visual recognition on your phones to unlock them, your iPhone or other, I don't really care if I understand what's happening in the model behind that. But I'll tell you, if I have a autonomous robot that's going to be cutting open my chest in surgery, I probably want it to be explainable, right? And understandable and explicable in many ways. So we have on the right, you see some research we have for when you have kind of a neural network based system, how can you not affect the underlying algorithms, but how can you create models in parallel to that to understand what's going on inside that neural network? If you can go to the next slide. If accidents happen, how do we know what went wrong? This is important on a lot of realms, right? This is important for liability issues. You know, one of the other major assured autonomy programs in the world is at the University of York in England, and they're actually funded by the insurance industry, right? You know, so the auditability is really important. But also, if we don't know what went wrong, how do we know how to fix it for next time? If you go to the next slide. How do you prevent systems from learning bad behaviors? I love this, you know, on the left, that's kind of a rolling stop. AI-enabled systems, when you're using learning-based algorithms, are based on data. Right? So how do we take data sets and make sure that as we're training our systems, they're not learning the bad behaviors, they're doing what we want them to do? And there have been some pretty visible examples of chatbots online that pretty quickly took on some of the worst behaviors of kind of online conversation on the internet. So how do we prevent AI-enabled systems from learning bad behaviors? So if you go to the next. How do you manage autonomous systems in a crowded dynamic ecosystem? If you're talking about the lunar surface, maybe it's not as crowded an ecosystem in some ways, but it'll have other challenges. But we're thinking about, you know, when you have autonomous systems, we're looking at kind of low altitude airspace. And when you have multiple autonomous systems that are not part of swarms, they're independent autonomous systems integrated with human systems and other environmental elements and factors, either in the built world or the natural world, how do you make sure you can manage those in that crowded ecosystem? We also spend a lot of time thinking about social robotics, right? I always say it's not just about the tech, it's about the team, right? The people and the tech together. Even when you have autonomous technologies, there are people in that equation, right? They may be remotely located, but they're part of the overall system. So how do you think about that interaction between those? If you go to the next slide, please. How do you monitor autonomous systems to ensure that they are operating as intended? And we have the supposition that you can't possibly design out all risk in an AI-enabled system, right? So we have a team, if you look on the right, you know, that's looking at critical infrastructure. As you bring more AI-enabled dynamic control to critical infrastructure, you know, whether it's power grids, whether you're talking about your vehicle traffic control systems, how do you monitor those? So we're building kind of novel white and black box monitor combinations to understand what's going on. And then if things start to behave as they're not supposed to, whether it's, you know, unintended consequences of the algorithms, or maybe they're malicious attack, right? Then you can switch to a safe algorithm until the system steadies out. So monitors and governors are an important piece of this as well. If you go to the next slide. And then policy. What often happens in a lot of different realms is that technology is created and leveraged, and policy kind of catches up to that, right? Policy, it doesn't always happen from the outset. So we look at how can you be more proactive about creating policy that will have the intended effects and the intended benefits. So if you go on to the next slide. And how could this technology be attacked? Right? Adversarial resilience is really important in a lot of the realms we're talking about, right? And there are many ways that AI-enabled systems can be attacked. It can be kind of more what you would call traditional cyber attacks, but it can also be input attacks, right? One of the things about AI systems is that they are, just like a human would with their senses, they are sensing the environment, taking that data, and your algorithms are creating actionable information out of that data. So, how could the sensory inputs be attacked? How could the underlying algorithms be attacked? So this is a really important area of study. If you go on to the next one. So this is why we created kind of this Johns Hopkins Institute for Assured Autonomy. It's relatively new. It's just in the past couple of years. And our vision is really driving a future where autonomous systems are trustworthy contributors to society. So the trustworthy piece really looks at the fundamental characteristics of the technology, but being a contributor to society in whatever realm you're talking about, there's a trusted element. Right. And so we often talk about the work we do is at the intersection of technology and humanity, because even if your technology and humanity are not co-located, the action of trust, right, and the state of trust is there's a fundamental human element to that. So what is it going to take to trust these technologies? And we do, no one institution is going to do this. No one sector is going to do this. So we really look at our role based out of the Applied Physics Lab, which is a UARC. How can we bring together industry, government, and academia? Very similar to kind of how your consortium is looking at it. And so at the end of the day, looking across the pillars we talked about to make sure these systems are safe, secure, reliable, predictable, trustworthy. So if you want to go to the next slide. So this is kind of the holistic framework, and I've talked about all of these pieces that when we think about, you can't just work on any one of these quadrants. You have to think about all four of these quadrants as you think about building assurance. Go to the next slide. And so this just shows kind of the research that we do right now. This is our initial research. Like I said, we're a new institute. We've stood up just in the past 2 years. This is our initial kind of round of research that we funded internally. And then we're also working externally with sponsors to drive more research. And one of the things that we talk a lot about, and I came out of 20 some years in the Navy trying to get the military to better adopt autonomous systems in ways that were consistent with all of these characteristics on the bottom. But that one of the challenges we have is there's lots of proofs of concept. It has been very hard with truly autonomous systems to get to scale. And I would uphold it's because the assurance issues. We have to solve some of these assurance issues to truly get to scale. I'm going to go to the next slide. So, we're also looking at some flagship projects. These are, you'll notice these are different domains, but a lot, pretty much everything we do is about building the tools and methodologies of assurance. And we use real world use cases to help drive that. But ultimately, these tools are translatable across domains. We look at vehicle and mobility ecosystems. We look at smart and connected ecosystems where you're really looking at a lot of data and how do you kind of manage physical, cyber physical systems and the decision control algorithms in connected environments. And we look at healthcare, right? Obviously an important area for Johns Hopkins. And, as we have increasingly aging populations and look towards AI-enabled systems in assistive care, both kind of in at-home and hospital environments, what do we need to make sure that these systems are going to work like they're supposed to? And for example, we also work with the military on looking at austere environments, right? So I think there are some connections to what you're looking at in the particular space domain. So if you want to go on. This is just an example of, we really focus on kind of tools and methodologies of assurance. And these are some of the things we look at, and there are many, many more. But there's no one silver bullet towards assurance. It's really that you have to, in parallel, look at all of these different things and more to get to the point where these systems that are AI enabled and acting autonomously are truly assured. So you go to the next slide. We just have, this shows kind of some graphics, and I talked about some of these projects along the way, so we can just click through the next couple of slides. Right, these are some of the projects we're working on, and if any of these are of interest to you, love to connect you with our teams, because really at the end of the day, it's about doing this together, right? It's no one institution, no one sector is going to do this alone. And I think the next slide is my get off the stage slide. So with that, I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to remind the audience that If you would like to ask a question, tune into Sligo and ask your question. There are a couple of questions here that we can ask in the meantime. First question, how would you recommend NASA implement AI on the lunar surface, similarly or differently?
So what I would say is that there are, you have to think about assurance from the very beginning, right? You know, especially when you're in such a remote environment. And I actually started out my career in the Navy working in the deep ocean environment. So there are some similarities in the sense of you can't have necessarily real-time connections, right? You're in a very remote and hostile environment physically in a lot of ways. So you have to have these systems that are very robust. And as you look at the algorithms that are acting, you need to make sure that they're very robust. So what I would say is there's a lot of opportunity to use autonomy and true learning-based AI. And you know, I would start with the low-hanging fruit, right? You know, where you have systems that can help monitor, right, in terms of kind of your maintenance and anomaly detection systems, in terms of when things are going wrong. You can get really early warning. You know, AI is great at anomaly detections and early warning systems, and then starting to kind of build it in. But I always say kind of take an approach where it's crawl, walk, run, but think about assurance from the very beginning.
Great, thank you. The next question, how do you evaluate level of trust, especially in life critical situations? Are there quantitative measures or qualitative scales like TRL or trust readiness level that are implemented in this case?
Yeah, so that's one thing we spend a lot of time thinking about, right? And trust means a lot of things to different people. So, you know, we're looking even at, we've done some semantic mapping across different arenas, right? And, you know, we work with a number of different groups on how do you quantify trust, right? First of all, what are the components of trust? And then how do you get to metrics and quantifiable? And it can be challenging because trust is fundamentally a human characteristic, right? Or a human attribute. And so we've worked actually with a human-centered design team to build a trust framework. And it's interesting. I don't have the slide with me, but there are 4 quadrants to this. One of them is kind of on the institution side in terms of who's bringing you the autonomy. And one of them is on the user experience side, right? And so of those quadrants, one piece of that is what are the actual capabilities of the technology, right? But then there's also the credibility of the institutions that are bringing you the technology, right? But then in terms of for the users and that human part of this human autonomy equation, there's user experience in the past with autonomous systems, right? And then there's also community priorities, and those can be all different communities. Like I said, I came out of the military, and even in the military, right, you know, you might have your pilot community that has a very different set of needs and requirements around trustworthiness than from the underwater community. I took my last job in the Navy was the Navy had stood up an office to oversee all unmanned things for the Navy in all domains. And we had a deputy assistant secretary of the Navy, and I was chief of staff, and he was a pilot. He came out of the Marine Corps, he was a pilot. I came from the underwater world, and we took him up to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and showed him, we had all these ocean gliders in the undersea environment. And some of these gliders were 200 miles off of track because they don't have, you know, advanced kind of station keeping ability underwater. And I thought he was going to have a heart attack because he was a pilot. And he said, well, you know, you'd lose your job pretty quickly if you came off of track that far. So that's just an example of one tiny element of assurance and how it can be different for communities. So you have to have a stakeholder-based process to start to really understand what your community needs from systems and the level of trustworthiness. You know, my example of kind of swiping up on a facial recognition algorithm, sometimes it doesn't work, and that's okay. You put a system in space, it's got to work, right? So you have to have kind of a robust stakeholder process to understand that trusted element before you can even start to put the quantitative metrics on those different elements.
Great, thank you for so much. I think we need to move on at this point, but thank you so much for calling in. This was great. You actually answered one of the questions right there that was already asked. So you filled in more than we actually anticipated. All right.
Thank you.
One more round of applause, please.